Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, network automators across the world, unite. We're back for the 2026 first episode of the year. We're going to do a little deep dive on Pulumi with our dear friend Scott. Scott, why don't you introduce yourself to the Network Automagic fan base of three people?
Thank you, thank you. So, hi, my name is Scott Lowe. I have been around in the technology field for a few years, um, and have bounced around between, I don't know, networking, virtualization, automation, cloud native, all that kind of jazz. So, um, if you were active in the VMware space back in the day when that was popular, then you probably recognize me from a few books that I wrote around vSphere. But in more recent years, I've been focused on cloud native. Spent some time at Heptio, hence the posters in the background, which then led me back to VMware after a stint at VMware doing NSX and networking stuff. And then since then, I spent some time at Pulumi working there after being a user. And now currently I'm at Cisco, having joined Cisco via the Isovalent acquisition. So back in Kubernetes land again.
Kubernetes land, that is a hidden place from most network engineers. We call it the cube people. Unlike the cloud people, they're sometimes on prem and they're just as difficult. Now, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into Pulumi to begin with? We're going to have to grill you at the end a little bit about Isovalent and the wonderful things happening in Cisco. And I am also a Cisco partner, so I will be saying wonderful things about that product no matter what. So, can you tell us a little bit about Pulumi and how you ended up there?
Yeah, sure. So I used to be, as a lot of people have been in the past. I used Terraform as my primary solution for doing cloud automation stuff, and I found Pulumi, just came across it in a reference. I think I was actually preparing a technology short take for my blog, and that kind of takes me all over the place, following links here and there, finding stuff to share with readers. But I came across this reference of Pulumi, and I was like, this is interesting. Let me look into this. And the idea being, and we could talk more about this in a moment, but the idea being that you could use a general purpose programming language to do your infrastructure as code. And like many people, I had kind of been bitten by some of the quirks of HashiCorp configuration language, or HCL, that Terraform uses. And I was just frustrated. And I was like, I'm going to give this a try. Now, I'm not a programmer by trade. I don't have a background in software development or anything like that. I've always been more on the sysadmin, network admin kind of side of the house. But I gave it a try. Started out with some TypeScript. Liked it. Uh, I felt like this is nice. This is nice sort of user experience. The language makes sense. It You don't have to kind of like twist your head into some weird mental um, pretzels to kind of figure out what is happening. You could look at the code, and if you could read the code, you could figure out, oh, this is what it's doing. I'm doing a for loop, and I'm creating three instances. Okay, cool. That makes sense. I later switched to using Golang
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to better my Golang skills.
Mm-hmm.
And since that time, I have used Pulumi pretty much extensively in Golang, which has its pros and cons, and we can get into that later. But after a couple of years of working with Pulumi, I think I first mentioned it in 20, 2018, maybe 2019, somewhere in that space.
The Dark
The
Ages,
topic,
yes, the Dark
yeah,
Ages.
exactly, right.
Mm-hmm.
And I got contacted by the folks at Pulumi Corporation,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted me to speak at their little event that they held, Cloud Development Summit, I think is what it was called. And so
Mm-hmm.
I spoke about it, how I was using it to help with cluster API testing. This was in the latter days of my stint at VMware after the Heptio acquisition,
Mm-hmm.
and we were heavy into cluster API, which is a key part of a lot of the things that VMware was doing at the time. So I gave a little presentation on how I was using Pulumi to assist with my cluster API testing, and that's fine. And at some point later on, they were like, "Hey, you're an active member of the Pulumi community. You talk about it. Why don't you come think about working for us?" And so I did. I joined as part of their developer relations team,
Mm-hmm.
um, and spent 2.5 years working there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then left in 2024 on good terms. I didn't leave because I was, mad at anybody or anything like that. I just didn't feel like it was the right fit for me in that role at the time.
Right.
And so that's when I switched over to Isovalent and then was acquired by Cisco. So yeah.
Happy little
But I
story
continue to be a
there.
Pulumi user throughout the entire process. Like I was a Pulumi user before I joined the company, and I'm still a Pulumi user now.
Ah,
So I guess you could look at that as some sort of vote of something for the
right.
for the project.
So for our listeners that have no idea what Pulumi is, you mentioned some aspects of it, like okay, we want to go from the dark. Most people have a reference of Terraform from the dark, the dark ages, which was cloud only. AWS provider barely worked. The Azure one, oh god, didn't even work. Especially if you want to provision something. So that was the cloud people's headache. Usually on this show, we don't care too much about the cloud people, but we will acknowledge their pain and suffering. So the network engineer, of course, is coming from a little bit different environment. You got to, manage your hosts a lot more differently. You got to, instantiate multiple instances of the provider, which is something, the cloud people look at you and go, what? Why do you have so many instances? One per router, dude. One per router. And then they start to shake their head at you. Like looking at the dark days, was it really that bad that you just had to go, no, HCL, damn you and your lack of, consistent for loops. I must have a for loop. What was the, stick that broke the straw that make you give up on Terraform natively back then?
Yeah, I don't know that it was any one thing in particular. Part of it was there was and is a reasonable community around sharing community developed Terraform modules that will do something
Mm-hmm.
that you want them to do, whether it's create an AWS VPC with some EC2 instances, or whether it's program routes into the VPC route table,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's, something else, right? On whatever platform, doing whatever thing it is you want to do. And as such, I'm looking at, well, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I have to do this thing. Let me go find if there is a community module that already does said thing and then adapt that thing for my purposes,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just writing the same thing all over again. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I think if I recall correctly, I started going out and looking for some Terraform modules to automate some of the things that I was doing to test the cluster API. And the HCL code was that I was finding for the Terraform modules was so cryptic. Like you go to look at it, and you couldn't easily reason about what that module was doing. Like it wasn't obvious where inputs were coming from or what outputs it was generating.
What's this
It
hard-coded
wasn't
Russian
clear.
server over here? What's going on? Like where? Like
Right. And just so some of the like I understand, why HCL is the way that it is, and I get it. It's a
mm-hmm.
declarative language, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it was just I don't know. Like I've always thought of when it comes to infrastructure as code and code in general, it's there's a saying in the programming space of don't repeat yourself, dry, right? Where they want you
Dry yourself to death.
to right. They want you to not reuse the same pieces of code over and over again. And they want you to modularize it and make it reusable and so on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great, to a point.
In
But I
theory, yeah.
always felt like, especially when it comes to infrastructure as code, that readability
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to comprehend what the code is doing is far more important than whether it is perfectly dry,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so people are writing this Terraform code and it's just not readable. And so you go back and look at this Terraform code 6 months from now and you're like, what was I thinking? Like, did past me hate future me? Like, I don't understand here, right? And that combined with, I think what I needed to do, one of the things I needed to do is I wanted to make some logic decisions. Like I wanted to have some control flow.
Mm-hmm.
If this, then that, else this, blah, blah,
Workflow,
blah.
basic workflow stuff, right?
Right. Very, very like nothing super complex, but just being able to make decisions in the infrastructure as code
Mm-hmm.
um,
Language.
code
Yeah, 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 yeah.
that did things based on what I was trying to do. And it was just so difficult to do that
Mm-hmm.
when you don't have control loops or control structures. And I just, it was like it wasn't any one thing. It was just the sum of all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, I'm done. I can't stand it. I hate, I don't use the term. I shouldn't use that term. I apologize. I very strongly disliked
We're
working
rated
with the
R,
tool.
honey. It's fine.
I really, I disliked using the tool.
Mm-hmm.
And because I disliked using the tool, it created a friction in my workflow because I was always reluctant to go in and change things. Because I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah.
And when I came upon Pulumi, and even though I wasn't a programmer and I had to upskill fairly quickly into TypeScript and then later into Golang, it still felt far more natural
Mm-hmm.
than I expected.
That kind of makes sense. We've been seeing a lot of that read off people, especially if you're trying to implement a small quote unquote finite state machine. Like I have 3 WAN links, and I just want to be able to drain and undrain and select which WAN link, and I don't want to be able to drain all of them at the same time. Please, Mr. HCL, please make it impossible for me to lose all my internet. And Mr. HCL goes, yes, but it will be the most annoying and complicated process imaginable. So, which is something, a couple of if statements and conditional selectors in Pulumi, I assume, in the language of choice. Sounds on paper, at least, sounds amazing, right?
Right.
So that brings us to, moving over to Pulumi. And so if you give us a high level, just the quick sales pitch, like, you started off in TypeScript, then the Go first showed up and peer pressured you into Golang. Nobody picks up Golang on purpose. It's always peer pressure. Prove me, fight me in the comments section. You don't need a compiled language. I bet 99% of you don't have the scale that, you don't need to process that many records. I swear to God, most of you will be fine with Python or TypeScript. But no. You want to be a cool compiled. Oh, my stuff is compiled. Sorry. I'm a gopher as well.
That's okay. I will actually agree with you. So the two SDKs that are the most popular for Pulumi, or were when I was there, were TypeScript and Python.
There you go. It's the
And
web people.
TypeScript, yeah, and TypeScript is a very mature SDK
Mm-hmm.
and is very very easy to use. I am a bit of a stickler,
Mm-hmm.
and so having a million node module directories scattered across my system, eating up
npm
who knows how
install
many
god.
gigabytes of space, it really irritated me.
Yeah.
But my choice to use Go was actually I tried to be active in various open source communities as much as possible, and I wanted to understand better some of the code bases that I work with, Kubernetes in particular, right?
There you go.
And learning Go, and at the very least, and I wouldn't call myself a gopher and I wouldn't call myself fluent in Go, but I can read the Go code and at least understand what's happening in the Go code. And that helps me in something like I'm trying to figure out how does, blah do blah, right? Mm-hmm. I can look at a module and be like, oh, okay, it's looking for this value and it expects that. And this is assumed to be empty. Okay, now I know kind of what's going on, or I can reason about it, right? And that's what kind of led me in that direction. Is I was trying to create some synergy between upskilling my infrastructure as code through Pulumi by using Go, while I'm also trying to become more familiar with Go in other contexts as well. And I will say this, I did learn enough Go to actually be able to make a couple of open source contributions to certain Go-based projects that I probably would not have been able to do otherwise. So I counted a win in that regard, at least. But the reality is, for the vast majority of users, if you are considering using Pulumi for infrastructure as code, seriously, just stick to Python or TypeScript. You'll probably be much happier.
You'll thank yourself later.
You will.
We've entered the LLM slop phase, and we're exiting the slop phase. And Claude is getting pretty good. Claude is getting he's getting with a little bit of review. He can make some infrastructure code. That's pretty okay. He's getting there, right? So most of the 10 years from now, people looking back and going to Grandpa's old podcast, they're going to be going, "Wow, you used to learn Go before you started you used to learn the language before you started the project. Wow, that's so cool." Anyway, sudo install all, but so it has native cloud. So like the high level thing that I got, I'm not a Pulumi user, so like correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. So it's the SDK integrated SDK system. You get to pick your own, language. Great. You get some UI options. You get a cloud deployment option. You get the enterprise cloud offering, Shazam. There's also can you draw the line between open source and the enterprise line? Like, where does that sit right now?
Yeah, sure. So sorry, I should have given you a better job of the 30,000 foot overview. But yes,
That's why I'm
there
here.
is a there's a Pulumi CLI that you would use, and this is very akin to any other sort of like orchestration or automation tool you might use. So you might run Ansible playbooks as a CLI, right? Same goes. You're going to run a Pulumi CLI. And that's the tool that you will predominantly interact with. And it's available, variety of platforms, variety of architectures. You can use it as a GitHub action, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then they have their SDKs in various languages. So Python, TypeScript, Golang, C#, Java, YAML, F#, VB.NET, whatever. There's a whole bunch of them, right? And those are the languages in which you'll write your infrastructure as code to do then orchestration for various cloud platforms, which could be any number of cloud platforms, AWS, Azure, GCP, Cloudflare, DNS Simple, take your pick, right? There's a whole bunch of them. Pulumi's sort of claim to fame, if you will, is there's sort of two of them. One is that you use this general purpose programming language, right, to do your infrastructure as code, but also they engineered a way to take the open source Terraform providers and bridge them over into Pulumi providers, which means that you can now basically use any Terraform provider in Pulumi code.
You get the worst of both worlds. Congratulations. Enjoy.
Well, yes, but it's and what it did is it neatly sidestepped the issue to say, I need to convince people to write providers for this new platform, right? And that's always been the barrier to entry. Is here you have this project Terraform, which has hundreds and hundreds of providers. Why would anybody bother to write another provider for little startup X over here when I can just put my effort behind the one that the community is already in, right? So in that regard, I give the founders of Pulumi a lot of credit because they came up with this process to programmatically bridge Terraform providers into Pulumi providers, and or to leverage both Terraform providers and Terraform code natively in the Pulumi engine, which is kind of cool. And that allowed them to sort of get some uptake without having to spend a huge amount of effort building out 100 or whatever number of providers. So you have these providers, and that provides the interface to whatever cloud platform you're using, whatever, right? Then on the back end, there is a SaaS offering called Pulumi Cloud, and it is primarily used for state storage. If you're familiar at all with infrastructure as code, then you know that generally when you run infrastructure as code, it's going to create some state of like, this is what is actually happening in the world, and this is what the user is requesting in the world, i.e. desired state and actual state, and then it performs state reconciliation to ensure that actual state looks like desired state, blah, 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 right? And without that state, it can't know kind of where things land and then know what changes to do. And Terraform's the same way. It also has state that you have to manage. So Pulumi Cloud is primarily a SaaS offering that does state storage, but it also, over time, they've been adding a bunch of features to it that let you do interesting things.
Security stuff, the normal, check the box, RBAC type stuff.
Right. Role-based access control. They have a feature called
rollback, right?
Yeah, exactly. They give you features to do like automated deployments and to undo these deployments, and they track all of your resource usage and give you a way to query all of your resource usage so you can see, do I have devices that have been out there and whatever, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So it's really kind of added a bunch of sort of cloud management functionality as opposed to just being a state store. So
right. So
but the core,
the money, no money up to the core, no money, cloud stuff, the free tier, and then money.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
See?
So the SDKs, the SDKs, the CLI, they're all completely open source.
Right.
And I'll come back to this in a moment. They're also free to use. I say I come back to the open source because they are open source. they're under a license that is a well-recognized open source license. But the vast majority of the contributors work for Pulumi Corporation because the code base is really complex.
Right.
So you don't see a lot of external contributors to the core code of Pulumi. Where you see contributors are in community providers. And there's a GitHub organization called Pulumiverse, and we can include the links for this in the show notes. That you'll see a bunch of community provided Pulumi providers that you can use to interact with the various smaller services that you want to automate with Pulumi. And that's where you'll see active sort of people, contributing to providers, updating providers, that kind of stuff. So yes, it is open source, but it's not
Wink,
like
nudge.
Yeah.
We know how we do. We know how we do these days. It's hard out there for Terraform and all kinds of people. Can't have Uncle Bezos showing up and taking the whole shebang on day one. And especially you wouldn't want another project showing up and, vampiring Pulumi like they did the Terraform providers, right? Like, they show up, they vampire the community and go, no, we are also Terraforms. This is fine. You will run with us and we are cool. There hasn't been a massive rug pull or anything like that. It's all been very much on the up and up. So save your hate for IBM. I'm not getting sponsored by IBM anytime soon. Just kidding. I love my red hats. Speaking of, some of if we go over the news articles, just, because we touched on the company and the structure, right? So some of the highlight Reddit posts are, oh, they fired all the devs and which is incorrect, which is, oh, they fired all the devs and replaced them with AI slop document writers, which are incorrect and blah, 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 blah. Like that's the general Linux hippie neckbeard feedback, which sometimes is valid, sometimes not so valid. The company looks like it's not growing at all. It looks like they've been stretching out their funding round a little bit. When I ask some of my financial, startup people, they go like, yeah, we don't know what's going on over there. Like they have 100 people, 3 job openings in startup venture land. That's basically life support. And you look at the GitHub, if you go with the GitHub metrics, I mean, it's been 20k stars and then 4k since 2024. You look at that line and it goes, okay, they got 20k stars in 2024 and then 4k until 2026. That is an interesting growth rate. Looks at an AI project that lets you cook lobster or something and it gets like 50 million stars in 5 minutes. So hint to Pulumi, buy some GitHub stars. That'll get you covered from the initial research phase very easily.
And I will say I really enjoy using Pulumi, right? But what you point out is accurate, right? They seem to have stalled, and as such, if you were considering enterprise adoption of a tool like this, it might be worth
waiting for them to be acquired. Just wait for
considering that
Broadcom. Yeah. Wait for Broadcom to show up and buy them, or IBM, and then you just go talk to your account manager, and he'll just,
or Microsoft,
or Microsoft, exactly. Love my Microsoft. I'm a provider as well. Love those guys. Yes, Uncle Bill. Love those guys. He hasn't been in trouble lately. Anyway, so we got they have some interesting stuff, and it's a private. It's still private, so we don't have any insights into the financials. Correct. We only have statements. I'll be honest with you, listeners, man. I did some AI slop research, and like all it pointed out was like all the announcements are from Pulumi themselves. It could be 2 badgers and a dead squirrel sitting in the office, and that could be it. Like we don't know who exactly is there. We see commits, we see stuff happening, right? And they went and they sliced up like a third of the company on this AI venture, I believe, right? What do you know anything about that stuff?
So prior to my departure, the company had invested some time adding AI capabilities in various places. So one of them was, they called it Pulumi AI, and it was a way for you to go to the website and use a chat-based interface to automatically generate Pulumi code in a language of your choice for a task that you wanted. So you could go out there and you could say, write me some Pulumi code in TypeScript that'll create an AWS VPC and launch 3 EC2 instances. And it would auto-generate some stuff. And the stuff was, this was 3 years ago, right? Yeah. Almost 4 years ago. So at that time, it was pretty decent. Given today's models, it would probably be even better. Right. But, and they thought that was like, the bee's knees. Yeah. Thank
Fire
you.
all
The
the
bee's knees.
programmers, network engineers, take them out back and shoot them.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then they added some AI agent, or not really agent, more like chat based functionality into Pulumi Cloud, where you could
Right.
ask AI questions about your resources and that sort of thing. Which is okay. That's fine. You know, if you're a company that has, you know,
First
50,000
level
resources
support.
under
Yeah.
management, then
Yeah.
yeah, identifying S3 buckets that have a public ACL out of all that stuff. Sure. I mean that, you know, that's useful.
There's use cases.
They've since pivoted to this Neo thing,
Yeah.
and I don't really know anything about that. That's all occurred since I left.
Yeah.
So I can't say whether it's good or bad or whatever. I
We wish them
just
best of luck with whatever,
yeah.
everybody's doing an AI play right now. So, we don't know which company is lying when they say that, oh, we don't need to hire developers, or we fired all the developers because we are so involved in AI, not because there's a recession going on and we're trying to pretend that everything is fine. That's the entire industry. We're not picking on Pulumi. They got really interesting tech. The founding story looks really good, but where my eyes go up is the 0.37 cents per resource per month on the cloud bill, compared to even Uncle IBM. You know, when when you're making Uncle IBM look kind of reasonable sometimes, that's an interesting thing. It might be a scaling limitation problem. Maybe they just need more money because as we've seen with OpenAI and all the AI startups, if you just have enough investor money to throw at the problem, you can just keep paying for other people users to use your product until you gain mass adoption. The Uber Eats model, as it is. Um, but the yeah, like there are a couple of questions, and I just did like 2-3 days worth of digging, after work. So please take everything I say with a grain of salt, and please, dear commenters, please show up and beat me up if I said anything wrong. But price aside, let's talk about how it stacks up against the current competitor landscapes. If you're familiar at all with that, I mean, the Amazon has their own, everybody's rolling out their own massive management framework, either for Terraform or for some infrastructure. Like infrastructure as code is a very wishy-washy landscape. Like, do you personally draw the line somewhere? Like, I like to focus this up as cloud people all the way to network engineers. That's a pretty good built solution. And then you have pure dev tools, like GitHub Copilot and that sort of thing, when you're trying to force your network automation workflows to use a Git provider, like you're kind of fighting the system half the time. You can do some amazing stuff, but you are kind of, oh, this is all designed for developers, and GitHub is really made for, code development. I'm trying to use it to automate networks. You're kind of fighting them every step of the way. Do you have any takes on the current landscape of IAC?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few companies out there that like you probably heard of. Obviously, there's Terraform. Um, Terraform, in case you're not aware, is now not open source. It was previously open source. It is now no longer open
The
source.
rug pull. Ah.
Yes, the providers are still open source, but the tool itself is not. And then, of course, there was a fork called Open Tofu that
Sure.
aims to maintain compatibility with Terraform that is
Mm-hmm.
open source. Whether those end up forking in terms of like diverging code bases diverging too far or not, I don't know. We'll see. It's anybody's guess.
Yeah.
There's cloud specific tools. So AWS has CloudFormation, which is largely YAML and JSON. They also have CDK, which is just YAML and JSON in a programming language trench coat. Um, there's Azure has what Bicep, I think is what they
Yep.
call it. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So it has their own tool. Google doesn't because they're Google, so that's fine. And then there's some other sort of cloud independent options. Crossplane is an interesting one. They leverage Kubernetes as the control plane and
Mm-hmm.
Kubernetes custom resource definitions, or CRDs, as their mechanism. And so you define in a declarative YAML fashion what you want your stuff to look like, and then it goes and does it. I guess you really just kind of have to decide whether you want to take a dependency on Kubernetes for your IAC. Feels a little like, you know, taking a dependency on something really complex to manage something really complex. But anyway, that's fine.
Yeah.
Um, and then let's see, is there anything else? Oh, there's Ansible. I think is still around. I always felt like
They're
Ansible
doing great.
as
They're doing great.
Uh, so I like Ansible
I
for
love it.
configuration management.
Yep.
Okay. I don't like Ansible for infrastructure as code. And that's just me. I always felt like using Ansible for infrastructure as code was like fitting a square peg in a round hole. Like if you push hard enough, you can make it work,
Hmm.
but it's never going to really feel great. And so it just kind of, it always felt like a hack to use Ansible for managing EC2 instances or whatever else, right? So I never really went down that path. There may be people who are being very successful with it, and that's fine. And I know of folks using Ansible, obviously, very successfully in a network automation context, and that's fine too, right? But in the infrastructure as code space, it was kind of like, eh. So that's kind of where I would put the landscape. Terraform / OpenTofu, Ansible, maybe some other configuration management tools in there. Possibly, I think most of those have died away. Then you have your cloud specific tools, and then Crossplane.
Right. So I mean, if we look at just the vendor landscape, because we're network automation focused, so we're gonna pretend we have a couple of FortiGates, we have a couple of Cisco, we have a wonderful selection of Cisco products sitting around, and they have Terraform providers in various states of development, shall we say, and they use different communication planes, and that's we're all good, and some of them have a horrible netconf / yang dependency, and then oh, you're on this version over here. Well, we don't have the general model. You'll have to use the old proprietary model, and then if you try to use the same module, like that's the Terraform headache. Same with Ansible, of course. If you're either CLI scraping and patching, well, actually, the CLI is the most stable thing we've ever seen when it comes to any of this crap. To be fair, all these years of bashing CLI scraping, swear to God, the AI has taught me that CLI scraping is amazing, and we should just let Claude do more CLI scraping on his own, without direct access to the box itself. Put a condom.
Read only access.
Read only. Not even that. Just put like a MCP with a condom on there, so he doesn't get the credentials. Nothing leaves. But so we have a couple of network devices, and if we were going to get started today, I mean, we'd either go down both problem tracks. If we were going to use Terraform inside of Pulumi, we're going to have the same Terraform issues with the providers and with the yeah, like I wish I could draw a really pretty picture for our listeners that it's just going to work, and if you're using the lab stuff, it's just going to work. It's going to be great. That's the example code. It's wonderful. Claude, your AI assistant, is going to help you get everything running. Soon as you enter production and you have something from 1999, or sorry, 2018, and it's not end of life yet, but it hasn't been you're gonna have some really bad implementations of gRPC or something like that. I'm not looking at you, Cisco ASR 9000 series. I'm not looking at you at all. I love that box for a lot of reasons, but not the gRPC implementation. A lot of reasons. Great box. Buy it. Don't buy it. It's EOL. So if you're going to go down this path right now, I mean, it's just trade-off bingo, right? I mean, there is no automatic easy win, right? That we're missing, right?
No, there isn't. Unfortunately, there isn't. And I think that in some respects, that is one of the contributing factors to why network automation hasn't gotten farther along
Mm.
is, people make comparisons between network automation to cloud orchestration or server automation, right? And saying, well, why isn't network automation farther along? Why can you take Ansible and just go configure a bunch of Linux boxes, or drive the cloud or whatever? And these are different use cases, right? There's sort of three use cases that I see here. One is cloud orchestration. So you're working against an API managed by an organization that wants you to consume more,
And
because the more you consume,
even they screw
the
it
more,
up.
the more you consume, the more you pay them. So of course they're going to make it as easy as possible. Oh, you want a CLI to spin up more cloud resources? By all means, here you go. You want an SDK? Here you go. You want APIs? Sure. They're maybe a little cryptic, but sure, here's some APIs, right? Oh, here's the documentation for the APIs. By all means, go consume more cloud resources. Go forth, be happy, consume more resources. So there's that use case, right? Then there's server automation. And in server automation, like, let's face it, we're talking about basically two platforms, Windows and Linux, right?
Mostly Linux, yeah.
And mostly Linux, yes, right? And we don't, like, yes, we care about the underlying hardware to some extent, right? But by the time we get to this server automation, we don't really care about the hardware. I don't care whether it's an HP. Is HP even a thing still? Anyway, I don't care if it's an HP server or a Dell server or a Cisco server underneath it. Like, I care about what operating system it's running. And again, it's mostly Linux. But even if it were Windows, there are somewhat robust solutions there, as robust as Windows solution can be. But when it comes to the last use case, which is network automation, here we have OSs that are tightly tied to the underlying hardware, whose interfaces and command line interfaces and APIs are all different across multiple versions of the same OS, same version of the same, different versions of the same OS across different hardware platforms. It's like what's that term? Balkanization, right? That's the term, right? It's like heavily fragmented, right? It doesn't matter, even if it's just Cisco, the state of Cisco orchestration on an NXOS device
is amazing, and you should buy those devices. Shut the fuck up, dude. They're listening. It's getting better.
But it's going to be different than another Cisco platform, which is different than an Arista platform, which is different than a Juniper platform, which is different than something else, right? So it's just there's all of this thing, and without some sort of standardization, which you're not getting good implementations of the standards, because RESTconf and NetConf and all of these, they all have their own, each vendor has its own unique sort of implementation of these standards, with their own little quirks that that you allude to. It just makes things really difficult. And I think a lot of that is really holding back the adoption and the growth of the network automation community, in my opinion. So
I agree, but I think that was, for me, always the reason why I preferred a plain programming language, right? If I did network automation, for me, the first choice was Python, and I had all the flexibility. So now I'm wondering, with Pulumi, as I have a programming language, but I still have providers and states, can I now do stuff that makes, let's say, a provider is lacking some flexibility? Can I add this in classical code? Or does all the information to the box or to the API needs to be going through a provider so that I can track the state?
So I'll just the answer to your question in a way to say, I've had people ask me, and I've even experimented a little bit with, but again, given that I'm not like a hugely strong given that I'm not a hugely strong programmer, I've only taken this so far, but can you combine, Pulumi things in a language like Python, for example, which is super popular in the network automation space? Let's say other network automation libraries, NAPALM, NetMiko, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. To do very interesting things, right? And the answer is, can you? Yes.
Should you?
Should you? That depends.
Is maintainability a concern, clown?
Well, less about maintainability and more about this. So Pulumi is even though you're using an imperative programming language, and a lot of people get hung up on this, right. Even though you're using an imperative programming language written in such a way that they generate a declarative result, meaning you are defining in an imperative language your desired state, and then the engine runs that program, gets a result, and then uses that result to declaratively through a provider to implement that desired state, right? And therefore, the operations that you perform with Pulumi are idempotent, meaning if I run Pulumi up, which is the same as like a Terraform apply, right? Then it will go and it will look at its state and it will calculate the current state, the actual state of whatever it is you're talking about. Compare that against the desired state that it has gotten from the result of running the imperative programming language that you have written it in, and then reconcile those two, right? Okay, so that's great. That's fine. No big deal. That's what we expect from an infrastructure as code tool. But the difference here is that in HCL, you couldn't do anything that wasn't declarative. And in Pulumi, you can. You can run other commands, right? You could use some other Python library, HTTPX, to do some async communication over, a REST-based API or whatever you want. The trick is that you, as the programmer, now have to ensure that the imperative methods that you are using are made idempotent and declarative, because Pulumi by itself won't do that for you. It handles it for its own SDKs, but doesn't handle it for everything else. So if you mix using a Pulumi module in Python to do something declarative with some imperative commands over here, and you don't ensure that these imperative commands over here are made idempotent, then you run the risk when you run Pulumi up again that this part is fine and this part's going to get screwed up.
Exactly.
And that's why I say, can you or should you? That depends. If you are willing to take the effort to make your operations idempotent, then by all means, yes, go for it.
I think that is what I expected. Yeah. So the clean way would be to write my own provider then.
Yes, that would be the best way. But that's just being honest. That's probably more effort than most folks would be interested in undertaking.
Well, that's not what my AI subscription is telling me right now. Click. Right? Good
Well,
code.
you know, you can YOLO it. That's fine.
YOLO, baby. It passes all the tests it wrote itself. It must be good.
Exactly.
I have another AI auditing a main AI. I'm a hacker man. Which, I mean, you know, people are getting good results. I gotta respect them. But like, you know, Terraform has, of course, changed a little bit. You know, you have more declarative options inside of it right now in the latest versions, especially around OpenTofu. You can do some shenanigans, like, you know, just to give my user a concrete example, like you could feed in, you know, let's say that you have a ticketing system and you need to feed in a valid change ticket, like that has a valid scope for the operation to complete. You know, one of the imperative flows that can exist inside of the declarative, I would like a server over here, is that you have a valid ticket and it's valid at the time of operational run. So that's one of those things that can break a fully declarative system, which is something a lot of people try to chase as much as they can. But then business process workflows show up and they go, hey, you know, we're going to need you to put some safeguards on it. We're going to need you to do some pre-checks and post-checks. And before you know it, you got yourself a little HCL, little, you know, pseudo scripting language doing a lot of greps on some JSON, and it's starting to get weird, right?
And if you're going to do all that, then just use a general purpose programming language anyway, right?
But,
so here's one of the really interesting things, at least in my opinion, is about Pulumi. And again, you know, take all this with a grain of salt. Do your due diligence. Make sure you're comfortable adopting a tool that may be, you know, like, we don't know the status of the company. We don't know how long they're going to be around. It's always a risk with any open source, you know, tool, right? So just to have that disclaimer, not a knock on Pulumi, but just in general, do your due diligence. But one of the really interesting things I found around Pulumi was that you could use Pulumi to program Pulumi. Okay. And so you could actually take, I know it's kind of like, whoa, Inception. You could take a general purpose programming language like I'll use Go as an example because I wrote some examples here. You could use Go, and then in that Go program, which is like a very much an imperative program, you could invoke the equivalent of the Pulumi CLI to then perform a declarative action, right? So you'd write like a regular Go program that is invoking Pulumi, which might also be written in Go or in a different language, to then do something declarative, right? And so this gives you a way to sort of very easily blend the declarative and the imperative operations in a way that kind of makes sense. And so what we saw at the time was this emerging platform engineering team that you hear a lot about, at least in the cloud native space, as those were the primary users, and they were building platforms and using this capability to not just do the infrastructure as code piece, but also to orchestrate the infrastructure as code piece. Again, using the same tool, which was really interesting. So, you know, take that for what it's worth.
That's very much you know, we're going to date ourselves as the unks that we are, but that's very much pimp my ride. We put a Pulumi in your Pulumi so you could Pulumi while you Pulumi. That's going to be the tagline for this episode. God, I'm good. So the main question that, of course, comes up is, you know, for someone who is wondering about taking the jump, you know, I'll put one pin in the fact that getting the full declarative, you know, normal programming language involved is that the Terraform provider, with all its faults, you know, you're going to get updated modules from let's just do my favorite Terraform module provided by Cisco. I'm really happy with the iOS XR one right now. All right, they fixed a lot of stuff. It's way better than it was a year ago. Life is good. All right, in iOS XR land. Okay, so I get that XR module. I'm guaranteed a few things. One, the code is controlled by Cisco, the company, so the Russians aren't going to patch it in the middle of the night most of the time, right? By Russians, I of course mean the Canadians. So the Canadians, we need that land. We got to have that land. You know, it's beautiful land. You're going to have it. We're going to take Canada for what they did to iOS XR. Trust me on this. This will be relevant later. So iOS XR is doing great. It's handled by Uncle Cisco. Try not to laugh at us. So that's a big benefit right there. It's automated. The update should be non-breaking most of the time. And unlike your programming solution where you're depending on the actual API yourself, you do get that middleman in between you and the actual device. So you know, oh, I'm going to update iOS XR to version blah next week. I'm going to check on the provider. The provider's ready. Great. I can do it at the same time and I don't break my workflows. And, you know, the guy who's going to be taking your job, you know, the teenager coming from school with the AI, with the LLM, he's going to appreciate the fact that you thought about him, you know, when you were deploying this before, you know, you were downsized. So, you know, think of the kid that is currently running your networks 5 years from now with his AI assistant. Putting the vendor in between can be great if they are maintaining the provider. This is not always the case. There's another firewall company that has a red one, and they are maintaining the provider, but their REST API on the base, just their base REST API is so bad. They don't even, because they're a security company, they won't send you error messages telling you what went wrong, you know, because F me, that's why. So they're the F company. So the F company decides to, you know, ignore all my issues on GitHub and say they're going to contact the team. And I have 30 issues open on that Terraform provider. It's not a good Terraform provider. You're just going to want to grab that programming language and talk directly to their horrible, horrible API, which is hidden behind a locked documentation portal that you have to get sign in from your F partner agreement person if you want to look at their API, which thankfully Papa Cisco has done many wrongs to me and many rights. And one of the many rights is they do not pull those shenanigans 99% of the time. So praise be to Papa C. Juniper's the best. Other than that, I mean, anyone rolling out a solution today, you know, we've laid out some of the landscape. We've laid out some of the things that are going to pop up. It's getting that in between layer. We looked at Pulumi as a company. You know, there's some hey going on, maybe, you know, but, you know, everybody just has to do their own due diligence or have their AI assistant do the due diligence. Oh, God, I'm going to be so cool a year from now. This is going to sound like I know what's going on. Transaction and rollback. That's usually the question of every network engineer fears and dreads, right? You know, you create this great automation workflow. We're deploying the VLANs. The VLANs are on the switch. High five, everyone. Now you're supposed to roll back the VLAN in the middle of, you know, a 3-stage operation. VLAN, IP address, and then, you know, DNS entry. One of those breaks, you're supposed to roll back, unless there's a dependency on the VLAN that was created in parallel to this, and this is where everything gets effed, and you need a manual resolution. What do you have a firm understanding of what Pulumi offers out of the box when it comes to transactions, rollbacks? You know, some SIA pattern adventure. What they got for me?
It's essentially going to be exactly what you would expect to see with Terraform. Yeah, I mean, you know, they're leveraging, almost always going to be leveraging Terraform providers that they bridged over from the original Terraform provider. So whatever warts the original Terraform provider had, they will also exist in the bridged Pulumi provider.
Great.
Or you're going to be leveraging a community supported provider that is community supported and
maintained by the Canadian. Yes, the Canadian is
yes.
involved.
Or one random Scottish individual. So if the provider is written well enough to be able to handle rollback, like it encounters an error halfway through the operation and then knows it needs to undo those changes to get back, then in theory you should be fine, right? Where you get into some, you know, corner cases, I'm not going to say it always will work, because I'm sure, right, that there is going to be some sort of exception, some sort of corner case where it will not. But in general, it will typically work. Where you start getting a little on some thin ice is when you start mixing those imperative operations outside of the declarative Pulumi provider operations, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
that's where it's going to fall on the programmer to make sure that they are handling that appropriately, and not creating dependencies like you alluded to, where you can't roll this back because now I'm dependent on this thing that I just rolled back in order to roll it back, right? You know, that kind of stuff. So circular dependencies is what I was thinking about. Yeah.
Circular
But
dependencies.
that means I can also, in the programming language, kind of interfere with the rollback logic, or is the rollback logic all done by the core?
The rollback logic is all handled by Pulumi itself and the provider, right? But where you might affect the the rollback logic is, let's say, if the code is unaware of something that handled outside of the provider. Like, let's say, I'll try and come up with a contrived example. Let's say you used a Pulumi provider to connect and create. Let's say you created so a VRF or some sort of switching context, something like that, right? And then you populated some outside of the provider, you populated some configuration information like an IP address or some VLANs or something like that. And then you took that information and then used it to populate, interface configurations or something like that declaratively, right? So we've got this non-declarative dependency in the middle of these two other things. And so the provider would know about the two things, but it wouldn't know about that one piece of glue in the middle. So when it goes to roll back, it'll roll back the first one, or the second one, which is the first because it's going in reverse order. It'll roll back that configuration change, and then go to roll back the other one that it knows about. But then we've got this thing that we created outside of it that is the dependency that it's like, wait a minute, oh, I can't because this other thing exists, right? And it'll just report an error saying I couldn't roll it back. Some sort of dependency exists. So that's why I say you run into some potential risk when you start mixing the declarative and imperative operations, and so you just have to be really careful there about what you're doing, right?
We call that a Fortinet
I will
special.
also say that there are, and I have run into this with cloud provider, with what we would consider very mature cloud provider providers. You can run into issues around it not recognizing dependencies appropriately. So recently, I was messing around a lot with VPC route servers, and just for context, the idea there being is it gives you, like basically a BGP peer that you could use to populate routes into a VPC, right? And the context was that I was working with a customer who was using Cilium and Cilium's BGP implementation to advertise routes out to their network. And I needed to do some testing. And even just within the AWS provider, and I was using the latest version, it would have problems recognizing, oh, well, I went to delete the route server peer, but it couldn't delete it because this other thing, the route server hadn't been deleted yet or whatever, and it didn't recognize the dependencies, and you just get errors, and you end up having to create a bunch of manual dependencies like, don't do this until you've done that, and don't do that until you've done that. Whereas the provider should have known about that on its own, right? So that's why I say generally it works, but not always. And when you start mixing declarative and imperative, then you run the risk as well.
Yeah, but that means you had the possibility to do this then manually, what in my opinion with Terraform would be a huge pain.
Depending
So So you have a way to kind of interfere or help the dependency map. It's just really painful.
Yeah, you can influence the dependency map, and there's ways. I don't recall ever experimenting with it, but if I remember correctly, there was a way for you to sort of create your own custom thing. Like, in other words, if you were stepping out to do something sort of like an imperative fashion, but you wanted to note that in the Pulumi state for purposes of dependency tracking, I seem to recall that there was a way you could do that, like create an entry in the dependency saying I'm a child of this and a parent of that, right? So that inside the graph of dependencies, it knew what was going on. But you would still have to provide sort of like the rollback mechanism, like how you would go about rolling back. And I could be misspeaking, so I apologize if that's the case. And if anyone from the Pulumi side is listening or whatever, speak up here. But because you were working with a general purpose programming language, you had a little more flexibility about managing the dependencies and stuff. And then there were the standard, like depends on sort of functions, which Terraform also has for influencing the dependency graph. Those were also present in Pulumi as well.
And this comes back to like atomics of the underlying API that's being the provider, whatever it is. I mean, sometimes you see these automated generated Terraform providers or Ansible providers where they just take the REST API spec and they just spit it out. No extra handling, no nothing, and they just go, yep, we support it. You should buy our product now, which is how a lot of Terraform providers got started and continue to be run by a lot of places. If it's a one-to-one with the REST API, we're deleting and we're getting this, but there are side effects when you create the object. Great, now we have a side effect and it's created an object group. But you created an interface. Great, now it's part of an object group. Oh, you got to delete the object group before you delete the interface. You can't just work over here, buddy. So you run into a lot of side effects. Life is very hard, and we always come back to the underlying REST API implementation. And should you be implementing a higher level one that's more, this is the nitty gritty stuff, but the actual thing the user's going to want to do is this. We will give them a nice interface to do this instead of giving him, 15 levers to pull, which is sometimes, something you wish you had, and sometimes you want the nitty gritty pull features. But this, of course, brings us to the closing of our show, and of course we're going to have to end with a controversial opinion take, but we're going to give our guest a few seconds to think about his controversial opinion. But wrapping up, Scott, what skill would matter the most? The metrics AI bot wants me to ask these types of questions. I apologize. What do you think is the skill that network engineers in automation field have to learn now? Like, what's the most exciting thing that's coming up? Is it Kubernetes networking, which is, YAML editing? What is it?
That's a good question. So I'll be thinking about my controversial opinion while I answer this question. Don't know if I have any controversial opinions, but we'll see. Anyway, I would, when asked about what network engineers should learn next, or what they should learn now, I've always been of the opinion that learning a programming language is helpful. So, go mess around with Python, since Python seems to be sort of the de facto choice for most network automation projects. Go mess with it. Go learn it. Python's popular in the machine learning and AI spaces as well. So there's some synergies there, right? I think it's sort of a tool that has applications in multiple facets. It's not like you learn this one thing and it's only good for this one thing. Instead you learn this thing and it's potentially opens the door to a number of other things. And that is just useful, right? Because then you're minimizing how much you're having to learn. You're saying, I'm going to learn this one thing, and then this one thing is going to get me progress on, A, B, C, and D over here, right? Rather than just this one thing. So it feels like a force multiplier. So I continue to say that network engineers should invest time in learning a programming language.
That's a really strong.
That being said, what's what?
It's a super strong take. You went with this is known as the Russ White study the fundamentals cop-out answer to that question. It's in the playbook over here. But it's the correct answer, because learning how to think will usually help you when it comes to dealing with systems.
Yeah, learning how to think is helpful. But here's my other thing that I think is useful, right? Is that the reality is that networking is evolving. Now, it may not feel like it is, but it is evolving, right? And I'm working with a customer right now, and I'm not going to say who the customer is or anything like that, but I'm working with a customer, and one of the people that I'm working with at this customer fits the traditional sort of network engineer persona, right? This is a person who is very familiar with, using SSH to get into a switch and write an ACL and can configure VLANs and, builds, leaf spine fabrics and whatever, right? But he is on a team that is implementing a Kubernetes-based platform. And he is digging into the intersection of Kubernetes networking and what you might call traditional data center networking,
How
right?
you break out of that cluster, homeboy.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like the border between cloud native workloads and hypervisor based workloads and cloud based workloads and physical bare metal workloads and all of that, all those borders are breaking down, and networking is the one thing across all of those. And to continue to insist as a network engineer that I only care about the switches and the routers, up to the private where the host comes in, and then hey, after that it's that other team's problem. I think, in my opinion, maybe this is my controversial opinion, I think that's short sighted, and I think you're doing yourself a disfavor or a disservice by not looking farther, right? Because the reality is that the network does extend into the server, right? And you, as a network engineer, need to know how that works and how that affects the stuff that you have traditionally focused on, right? So there you go. There's my controversial opinion.
That's not even that controversial. I mean, this is
Well, dang it.
we saw this 15, 20 years ago, right, with hypervisors.
Yeah, but nobody
old,
listened then.
Yeah, but the
They're
crusty
still not
McCrusty
listening.
guys with this console cables went, oh no, I care up to the when I see the Dell logo, I put it in. That's where I stop. After that, MAC address is on there. That's your problem. vSwitch, don't know what it is. Have a nice day. Those guys aren't around anymore. Okay, guys and gals. Those got wiped out. Don't get wiped out on the Kubernetes front, where you have to go into the hypervisor, and now you're inside of the freaking cluster, and now you're thinking about sidecards and fabrics inside of the damn thing, and you're going, wait a minute, I can enter on any of these nodes. The port doesn't matter, and it gets internally load balanced by the default Kubernetes. Why are we buying this fancy isovalent product that's going to do a lot of wonderful things for you on your wonderful Kubernetes journey? Regarding security, telemetry, and metrics, why go and bear back into the Kubernetes hellscape when you can have a solid, trusted network vendor like Cisco provide you something like Isovalent? Bridge the gap between the horrors of open source and your trusty Cisco stack. Cisco Isovalent, available at your local retailer. See, I've earned my Cisco points back. I get to keep my CCA number. No, but it's a really cool platform. Calico, who are those kids? I don't even know. Isovalent. That's where I'm at. So that's a solid controversial opinion. We'll lock it in as a, hey, keep learning, guys. That's kind of always been the message. Don't just listen to what the LLM tells you. Go talk to the AI, but don't trust the AI, maybe,
Trust
Scott,
but verify.
Trust but Soviet Union, two-ply toilet paper, one for you, one for, documentation. That's why it's two-ply. Now, Scott, where can people, if they want to stalk you, is there anything they should be stalking that you're doing online? Are you evangelizing the fine products of Cisco Isovalent?
So I still I don't blog as much as I used to. I still do blog. And a lot of that does come out of stuff that I have to do from my day-to-day job. Obviously, all sort of sanitize and all that. I don't talk about customers or anything of that nature. But we take I try to take lessons learned and make them a little more generic, a little more applicable to a broader use case. So you can visit my weblog, blog.scottlowe.org. I'm not as active on social media these days anymore, but I have a presence on the platform formerly known as Twitter and Blue Sky and on Mastodon. So feel free to reach out to me there, and I am on LinkedIn. But you can also just drop me an email, and it's really not that hard to send me an email. I love to hear from readers or other folks, listeners to podcasts. It's really not hard to find my email address. I'm not going to share it here because I'm not going to give the bots the easy answer, but it's not that hard to find. So.
Oh boy, the podcast advertising bot that has been scraping this episode, trying to get me to buy some sort of service to advertise this thing, is really going to be upset that you didn't give him the email, Scott. You gotta think about the bots, man. They gotta eat too, allegedly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of questions came up in the listener's mind, like, hey, I want to learn more about this Kubernetes networking thing. What is this Isovalent stuff, and how does it improve the initial Kubernetes stack and make it actually functionable? These and many more questions will be answered on later episodes of Network Automagic. So, on behalf of me and Urs, thank you for listening.